Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. We're going to go ahead and get started. There may be additional people joining us, but we want to be cognizant of the time because we have lots of great information to share with you. So today is the final day of the Shutdown Restart 2022 Student Success Summit. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues at MCCA, Erica Oriens, Precious Miller, and Jenny Schenker for all their hard work on putting together a great summit this year. We hope you found your time spent with us engaging and valuable. Today's agenda, we're going to be focusing on the MI transfer pathways and strengthening those pathways here in Michigan, focusing specifically on student success. We are joined by Paul Fain, who's going to really talk about the national spotlight with all of this. And then we're also going to, between Erica and I, talk about the Michigan component to some of these topics. And then as we've been doing for the last 3 days, we're going to end with speed networking. If you've been with us this week, you've seen this slide. We hope you've had the opportunity to download and use the journal to take notes, record the people you've met through these virtual sessions, and have engaged in the speed networking. All of the slides and recordings will be uploaded to the Summit page on mcca.org. And I think Precious is going to put that link in the chat for us. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers today. We're very excited to welcome Paul Fain to our session to talk about the national landscape of workforce development. Paul is a journalist and analyst focused on higher education. He is currently the editor of The Job, a weekly newsletter about connections between education and the American workforce. Prior to launching The Job, Paul was an editor and reporter at Inside Higher Education and the Chronicle of Higher Education. And Precious, could you also put a link in the chat to Paul's newsletter? If you haven't subscribed to his newsletter yet, you will find it very valuable, especially if you are engaged or working on anything related to workforce development at your institution. Next, I'd like to introduce Erica. I'm sure most of you already know Erica, but she joined MCCA in 2015 as the executive director of the Michigan Center of Student Success, where she supports community colleges in their efforts to improve student success. She previously held positions at the University of Utah, the Ohio State University, Miami University Middletown campus, and the Columbus College of Arts and Design. Erica's also taught undergraduate and graduate level courses at several institutions of higher education and enjoys staying active in local, state, and national professional organizations. As for me, some of you, I may seem familiar, my name might ring a bell perhaps, but I began my work with MCCA in 2016 as a consultant after retiring from Macomb Community College. I also provided consulting support to a variety of higher education institutions and organizations across the country in the areas of accreditation, math pathways, earnings data, and a variety of transfer initiatives. In addition to my 20-year career at Macomb, I've been an adjunct faculty teaching undergraduate and graduate courses for the last 30 plus years, just a little while. Next, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Ascendium for supporting this work. Without their generous funding, we would not be as far ahead as we are. So we greatly appreciate that funding. So now I'd like to turn it over to Paul. Paul, tell us about the national landscape related to what people are discussing in 2022 from the employer's perspective and what you are hearing from colleges and universities across the country. Paul?
Thanks, Donna. Hello, everybody. Happy Friday afternoon. Thanks for having me. Excited to be able to chat with you. And I'm really more accustomed to being a listener than a talker. So I hope you all ask questions. I'm planning to go probably the full 10 minutes, a little longer maybe, on this national spotlight piece, and then leave more time in the subsequent bits for conversation. But you know that phrase, "May you live in interesting times." I believe that was a curse. I've heard that, but I think we all can agree that these are interesting times for higher education and society on the whole. And just wanted to briefly, to that note, discuss what sort of journalist I am. It's an interesting time for journalism too. So I think, this isn't about kind of touting my laurels, but more that you can understand where I'm coming from, because I think a lot of people don't understand journalists' role in society these days. So I'm a fully independent journalist. I'm not an advocate nor an expert on anything. I'm a layperson. My newsletter, The Job, is independent. It's run out of my basement. It's largely revenue free. I sold my first ad the other day. Maybe I'll sell some more. But while there are downsides to having a small operation, the upside is nobody controls it, and there's no crowd that I'm playing to with this. I don't have to cover the culture war, which is where the clicks are, and I don't have to sell to higher ed or any other industry. And my audience, just so you get a sense of who's reading it, it's folks in higher education, largely that work in open access institutions, employers, a growing number of them. The downside there, mostly big employers. One of my weaknesses is in understanding what small employers are doing, and we need both to make changes that I think we're going to talk about here. Academics read it, researchers, think tanks, and other journalists. So the central premise here, I'm agnostic about post-secondary education. I think it's generally a good thing, but I don't necessarily think any institution is inherently good or bad. And that means in an era of enrollment drops, I'm not going to reflexively say that people should be going to X institution or Y. This is something I thought about a lot at Inside Higher Ed. I'm still very close with those folks. What is higher ed anyhow? When I'm gonna return to Amazon a lot today. When Amazon rolled out its free college program, the Career Choice program for its 750,000 employees, my editors and I at Inside Higher Ed said, is this even really higher ed? It's a company, it's a sponsored program. They are going to attend college. But the areas, it's getting a little gray with employer involvement in some of these programs. But what I'm not going to do, and I say this with all respect, but the Chronicle's coverage of that rollout was pretty much captured it all for me. The headline was, and they did a good job with the story, but it was Amazon's free college program, what's in it for higher ed? And if you think I'm making that up, go look it up. But that's not where I came at this. Where I came at it from. What I report and what I'll share with you today is a synthesis of what I hear from a wide range of expert sources who happen to overlap a lot with who reads the newsletter. And my approach is generally to follow the money. That means reporting on policy shifts in federal and state support for higher education programs, as well as the small but growing amount of money that employers are spending on education and training. And I shouldn't say that it's small on the whole. Some estimates, there aren't good ones, are that employers are spending up to $30 billion a year on education and training benefits for their employees. So my focus is where change is occurring, and I believe there are quite a few changes occurring. I don't think the college degree is going away. I don't think four-year institutions are largely threatened, although some are. But I do think lower income students are changing their preferences. And I don't need to tell all of you that. And I'm bullish on this being what some folks call a plastic moment, a time of accelerated change, where a decade of change could happen in a year or two. And that's largely, of course, because of the pandemic. And I don't think we're headed back to the status quo of 2019, but I would love to be challenged on that point. Couple reasons. Well, let me first say what I mean by that. I do think enrollments will continue to shift away from degree programs and toward, if they do return, shorter term credentials, as well as potentially even non-college options like apprenticeships, which of course can involve degrees as well. How much change are we talking about? Not huge, but a percentage point, 2-3 of the total US market would be just enormous. And I think that's on the table. I know a lot of people think it is. What gives me the confidence to say that? Obviously, the severe enrollment declines that we're all seeing. It goes back more than a decade, although you might not know that from some of the discourse on the current moment, but it's obviously worsened a lot in the pandemic. Undergraduate The total population in the US is down 9.4% since the pandemic began. That's 1.4 million students. Of that 1.4 million, 830,000 were attending community colleges. And this week, the Joint Center just put out some new numbers that really sharpen this. Among Black community college students, we've seen a 44% nationwide decline over the last decade, the decade before the pandemic, and an 18% decline in the first 2 years of the pandemic. So this is serious stuff. And not everybody's down. As some of you may know, both Western Governors University and Southern New Hampshire University served more than 200,000 students last year. Those are the 1 and 2 biggest universities in the country now. And Arizona State Online was up 7% this fall. It's now 63,000 students attending Arizona State Online. And it's not just higher ed, it's the pipeline, as you all know. K-12 enrollments are down. We've seen massive increases in homeschooling. It was tripled, that number tripled early in the pandemic. It was 11%, the last number I saw. That's come down, but you just think about today's students have experienced a very different reality, and that's going to affect the higher education pipeline for years to come. It's not just higher ed, of course, it's also the labor market. You know, unemployment may be quite low right now, but there's over 11 million unfilled jobs. And some of the individual industry numbers are unbelievable. 1 in 3 cybersecurity jobs are open. And if you look at who holds cybersecurity jobs, we have a diversity crisis in this country in terms of job opportunities. More than 80% of those jobs in cyber are held by men and white people. So you've got a lot of pull from industry to try to make change in how people are prepared for jobs. Employers largely haven't stepped up at the scale I think folks would like to see, but we're seeing more of it. And that's because this is a serious crisis for many employers. What's happening with the federal budget? Not too much in this space. The feds, as you may have heard, are looking to forgive student debt. And they also backfilled higher education budgets to the tune of 80 billion over the pandemic, but that money is largely gone. So I think most analysts think that the higher ed budget problems are still to come. The federal government has spent under the Biden administration a couple $100 million more on apprenticeships, and some folks think more will come there. But most of the action in kind of workforce education has been at the state level. And you're seeing a lot of tailored kind of in-demand industry subsidies for short-term training in the states. And I think what was really worth watching there is the strings that are attached. There's often performance-based strings that these new pots of money include. And in some cases, they are staunching the enrollment loss. I'm talking to folks in Michigan. Michigan Reconnect, it looks like, has actually helped on that front, as you all probably know. It's other states as well, though. Maine is up in its community colleges because of a new free community college program. And we're seeing similar enrollment bumps where there's some of these subsidized short-term programs in the states. That includes Virginia, Louisiana, and California. California has an interesting one worth watching from the California Student Aid Commission, $500 million in short, small grants, $2,500 each for in-demand job training. And just like a lot of these, the California Student Aid Commission is creating a performance regime for this to hold institutions accountable for the results of that program. Employers are paying more to prime the pump. Aon in Chicago is an interesting model. They have 1,000 apprentices in Chicago alone, a goal of getting up to 10 to 20,000 in the next few years. Google is doing some interesting stuff. I'll return to this in a bit, but they offer their own online certificates for entry-level IT jobs, and they just took out $100 million pot of money to help finance the wraparound supports for students in these programs with a goal of serving 20,000 students in the next few years. Again, Google's a big company, they're easy to talk about. 20,000 students is, it's a substantial number, and they're just getting into this business. Amazon, of course, I mentioned them already. I just learned this week, their career choice program now has 250 partners. 4 of them are national online universities, including Western Governors, but quite a few non-college partners. They have gone, they're doing this themselves, and they have started to work with some places that don't have accreditation and are kind of upstart, often online programs. One of them is an ESL program. It's called NGen. It was founded by Katie Brown, as a former ESL instructor at community colleges. And Amazon tapped NGen to be its primary ESL provider through this program. And this is what Katie Brown told me. Most ESL programs at two-year colleges teach English for academic purposes with an ostensible goal of preparing students for academic courses. This approach is reminiscent of remedial education, where students spend time and money on non-credit courses. This is a quote from her. These are one-size-fits-all programs based on academic reading and writing skills, and learners have to complete them in a fixed sequence, often with no credit or only elective credit before they're able to take courses toward their degree. And Amazon agreed with that argument and tapped NGen for their program. You know, I'll close this here in a second, but I feel like my beat, the higher ed beat, I really upgraded to a much bigger one, which is income and wealth inequality, which I think is one of the greatest challenges of our era. And you're really seeing the urgency driving some of the change here. Just this week, a group called Opportunity at Work. If you haven't heard of them, I'll put it in the chat. They're a nonprofit group founded by folks who came out of the Obama administration that are pushing employers to hire people without bachelor's degrees, to focus beyond the bachelor's degree. They include community college degree holders in their definition of people who are skilled through alternative routes. They call them STARS. And just this week, with massive backing from big companies, Google, IBM, Walmart, and the Biden administration, they rolled out a campaign called Tear Up the Paper Ceiling, which you will probably see on your streaming service soon. But really the big moment for me to have the confidence to take out my own thing with this newsletter, I did this interview with the CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, when I was at Inside Higher Ed. And he's a character. I knew I was going to be interviewing him on stage. I didn't know he'd show up in the green room and talk to me for a half hour before I did this. But JP Morgan, if people don't realize it, they employ 300,000 people all over the country, lots of entry-level, low-income jobs. And many of those people are going to be outsourced. They're going to be automated. And JP Morgan is legitimately concerned, and this comes from the horse's mouth, about societal collapse. This is obviously a very deep-pocketed company, but that's extremely worried about their supply chains, worried about the communities they're in. And they're spending $30 billion on an inclusive recovery. And literally the amount of money they're spending on community colleges is in the $1 billion category. So, when I heard that, I felt like if JP Morgan is worried about society collapsing, maybe there's something to write about here, but I'll stop there. I've got more to say.
Wow, thanks, Paul. That's a helpful perspective on the national landscape. I know you're going to come back and talk to us about a couple more specific topics later. But while we give you a little bit of a break, Donna and I wanted to talk about some work that's happening in Michigan. And I think much of this has really been inspired by what Paul and some of his peers have been writing about kind of this transformation in the labor market and what employers are looking for. And at the Center for Student Success, we are working with a cohort of 7 colleges who have selected a program at each of their institutions and have decided to focus on how they can use a lot of data, a lot of resources to figure out how they can improve completion in those programs, to improve equitable access to those programs or equitable completion, or identify reasons why students aren't completing their programs. You see the 7 colleges that we're working with here in a variety of different program areas. And what I want to do today is I'll talk to you a little bit about who our partners are in this work. Donna, if you want to go on to the next slide. Some of these will look familiar to many of you who have been involved in the work at the center, working with the United Way and their United for Alice report, the Community College Research Center, and the Aspen Institute, who do a significant amount of research on student success in community colleges. And then on the bottom half there, really, we're thinking a lot about the labor market data, and really that completing a degree isn't necessarily enough. We want to see how students are doing after they graduate from our programs. What I'd like to do now is just provide you with, I think it's five little nuggets of work that we're doing with these institutions. At the end of our slide deck, I shared links to all of this information that I hope you'll be able to take a little bit of this back to your campus and use some of the resources that we've created through this network. So the first thing that the colleges are doing are analyzing and disaggregating program completion data. Some of you are probably experts in using the IPEDS data center, but most of us don't have access to that level of data. And our friends at the Community College Research Center created a dashboard that extracted completion data from IPEDS and put it into a very handy chart where you can look at completions in your programs and compare that to completions at other institutions across the state or across the country. These data are also disaggregated by gender and race and ethnicity. And I think what institutions are learning from this is really seeing where they're not addressing equitable outcomes. Really great data if you don't regularly have the chance to look at your completion data at your institution. I'll move on to the second topic of focus for us, which has been reviewing our graduates' labor market outcomes. For those of you who have been around higher ed for a long time, you know that it has been persistently problematic for community colleges to get any access to labor market data. This has been a problem across the country. It's been an acute problem in Michigan as we've tried to get access to particularly wage outcome among our graduates. But we have been using the college scorecard to look at labor market outcomes, and the college scorecard for selected programs that have to meet certain minimum number of graduates are able to report labor market outcomes. I think that this has been a huge improvement to the college scorecard. And if you haven't gone out there to see that yet, strongly encourage you to see what the college scorecard says about your institution, and particularly pay special attention to those labor market outcomes, as I hope this will become a area where we expand access to data, because this is, it's very hard to improve labor market outcomes if you are not tracking them. The third thing we're doing is actually also on the college scorecard. And I think another thing that they report is loan and debt data for your specific graduates at your institutions. I think there's a public narrative around community college being free or affordable or inexpensive, which is true for many of our students, except we still do have a substantial number of students who take out student loans, and their total debt after graduation is not negligible. I don't know what college this is from, but you can see here that 30% of students at this institution receive federal loans, and the median total debt after graduation is $9,500. This isn't an insignificant amount of money at $95 a month for repayment. And I think when we are able to compare the labor market data, the great thing about the college scorecard is we can look at labor market outcomes, we can see how much those students are earning a month, and also how much debt they're going into by program. So a lot of our programs are looking at that and educating themselves on what debt obligations students have. I mentioned our partnership with the Aspen Institute earlier. They published something called the Workforce Playbook several years ago, which is really just a terrific resource. Many of you have seen us share the Transfer Playbook, Developmental Education Playbooks. Playbook is a popular thing in community colleges, I think, but this is worth a read. What CCRC and the Aspen Institute have done with the Workforce Playbook. And I think takes that idea of our traditional advisory boards for our programs and really amps those up and elevates those experiences so that colleges can respond to employer needs in much the way that Paul was describing earlier. So definitely check that out. The other thing that we were able to provide all of our participating institutions from the Aspen Institute is a customized local labor market data book. Paul mentioned earlier one of the one of the underreported areas, I think, in the labor market are small employers. And for our colleges that are in rural communities, it's almost exclusively small employers. And so while there's a lot of focus on large employers, Google, Amazon, those things, that there's a lot of opportunity to look at labor market data among smaller employers. So we worked with the Aspen Institute, used Michigan labor market data along with Lightcast data, formerly MZ and Burning Glass are now Lightcast, to be able to do some local analysis of labor market trends and projections in the future. And then finally, and I think ties very nicely into what Paul talked about earlier, is the challenges that we're seeing in our own communities. And I think many of you, Precious has introduced you to Alice in the past through our My Best work. But I think that another area that our colleges are focusing on is that ALICE population. For those of you who don't know, ALICE stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. And they are the people that live in our communities who have a job, they go to work every day, but they don't make enough money to meet the household needs for families. And if you haven't done so already, the ALICE work in Michigan has, I'm showing you statewide data right here in terms of total households across the state of Michigan. These data are available at the county level, and in some cases, they are available at the township level. And if you don't know ALICE in your community, I would strongly encourage you to see what the household budget is in your community and give some thought to comparing that also, as many of our colleges have done, to those debt obligations and to the earnings as students are graduating from our programs. So with that is a little bit about what we're doing in Michigan, and we'll pause right now to see if there are any questions in the chat for Paul or Donna and I. Looks like any of my colleagues see any questions they want to share? Jenny asked how colleges, Paul, have you seen any examples of how colleges have transformed ESL to address some of those employer needs?
I haven't, honestly. And if you hear of them, please send them my way. I'm sure folks are working on this. I was kind of surprised, frankly, to hear that comparison to developmental education, and it frankly, it made sense to me. But yeah, I don't know if folks are doing anything on that.
Great, thanks. All right, maybe we'll go ahead, Paul. We'll turn it back over to you. And if we go on to the next slide, I think we touched on this a little bit. And I think that question about ESL is a good transition, but we wanted to ask you a little bit more about if you could focus a little bit more on these trends in training. There's a lot of conversation about short-term Pell. We had a session on Tuesday where we heard from federal lobbyists who, really want short-term Pell to pass. But I know a lot of your reporting covers topics around what employers are thinking about training and what the future of that looks like for them. So if you could just talk with us about what you're hearing from people.
Absolutely. I wish I'd heard that session on what folks think is going to happen. You never know here in Washington. So I'll back into it very briefly. I mean, I think I'm glad you mentioned labor market data, Erica. I feel like in most of the circles I talk with, it's not controversial to say that higher education should pay attention to return on investment. It is still controversial in some areas, but I just don't think people can underestimate the impact that the data that's now 5 years old from Raj Chetty and Opportunity Insights had on this conversation. This, of course, was the big social and economic mobility findings that lots of higher ed is not moving people up. It just, I think, to me, really crystallized a lot of changing opinions about holding higher ed accountable. And, to me, the debate on return on investment and value sometimes gets into this "is college worth it" frame, which is frankly not smart. The bachelor's degrees and associate degrees too are a much better bet than not having college. But I think obviously folks need to graduate and not take on unmanageable debt. So I mean, a better question would be, how risky is my investment of time and money in this program? And that is borne out by the data of why people aren't enrolling. There's a big data drop coming soon from a company called College App, which is fascinating. If you haven't heard about it, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you are working with them, but they have incredibly granular data on prospective students everywhere. This is a huge database that's being applied to prospective students, specifically focused on community colleges. And, they're seeing massive interest in the population of young people. I'm talking 20, 30 somethings who have left the system. And that means the labor market too. They want to enroll in college, but they have doubts about whether it will pay off. They aren't confident about their investment of that time. And it surprised me, frankly, that's the number one barrier to enrollment that this company, I just heard about this yesterday, is finding. They did some incredible survey work on this. More than the money and more than the time barrier that we've heard a lot about. Of course, 70 to 80% of people say that they want a good job. That's their top priority in going to education. And we're in this moment where I think because of the debt discussion, everyone feels like college is out of reach, even frankly, when it isn't. I was talking to a bunch of students at California State, which is the most affordable four-year university in the country. And they felt like, $5,500 was too much, and that maybe they should drop out. And I was like, no, I'm a journalist, but don't do that. You're not going to find a better deal than Cal State. I'm going to get to short-term credentials. We had a piece this week, really interesting, rural job growth. A lot of rural counties are seeing growth in IT and healthcare jobs. And some community colleges are in those areas are trying to change to meet that demand. We quoted Tracy Hall, the president of Southwest Tennessee Community College, who said, "We don't teach what we want to teach, we teach what is needed." So if students say they want these short-term programs, they want that manageable bite-sized program, can that be an on-ramp? I don't know. I think, and I'm going to get to stackability in a second. But again, to mention Virginia and these short-term credentials that are tailored with labor market data to jobs that are there. I mean, I hear this all the time, and I'm sure you all can say this. Love hearing from employers about, if you just created this short-term credential, that would really help us out. And then you do, and then they don't hire your graduates. I know that's a problem. But I think if people are really at the table, which it sounds like they are in Virginia for the, the fast forward, they know where the jobs are. They have outcomes baked into this program. So basically, for students to get the full scholarship, they have to complete. And for colleges to get their portion of that state subsidy, it's based on completion as well. So you have some of that. I see you're in the chat now. With that, thank you for that. Lorain County Community College in Ohio has a similar short-term credential program called Fast Track. Again, free, high demand fields backed by labor data. So I'm going to get to the debate here over short-term credentials. I'm worried that this is going to become even more politicized than it already has become. And I'm picking on the Chronicle. I used to work there. I can do that. They had a great piece this week on the federal government, which I didn't realize, backing off of their promise to try to collect data on non-credit programs. But the way it was framed, I thought the piece was good. This is literally the headline: "The mystery of short-term credentials. Colleges and lawmakers tout them as a speedway to good jobs. Where's the data to prove it?" Like, first of all, it wasn't just short-term credentials, it was all non-credit programs. And I think there's a bit of a straw man there. Like, I think we all know we lack data on these programs, and I don't think anyone is saying they definitely pay off. And I think you could say the same thing, frankly, about a lot of degree programs. And this is a recurring theme. I used to write a lot about competency-based education. It's the truth with online education. They're going to be held to higher standards than the traditional college program. It just is what it is. And I think that's going to happen with short-term credentials. And this is my favorite quote from the Chronicle on this. They just released a report on career education. It's one of these $180 reports. And their little bullet line of the key finding on short-term Pell or short-term programs was: boot camps and short-term credentials are a threat to overcome. They can be overcome. I'm like, threat to who? Like, I think a lot of colleges see opportunity in short-term programs. It's not necessarily an either or. And as you all know, a lot of colleges are trying to embed professional certificate programs in degree programs. It's the both and approach. However, I do think quality is a legitimate concern on short-term credentials. If I was really fascinated to see Representative Virginia Fox, who's a Republican from North Carolina, who, if the Republicans win the House, will be in charge of the Education and Workforce Committee. She gave a talk this week or late last on short-term Pell. And interestingly, she positioned it in opposition to debt forgiveness. It was, the Biden administration, the Democrats want to forgive people's debt for degree programs that aren't paying off. We want to have short-term programs instead. That's a dangerous framing, I think. Frankly, if short-term programs are viewed as a Republican, preferred route versus degrees. But the rest of her talk, she was talking about guardrails, and some of these guardrails come from CCRC, groups that have studied this. They're looking at the Republicans' initial bill, 70% graduation rates and 70% job placement rates, and tying the income boost to tuition price. So basically, to be eligible, the price of your short-term program under the Republican plan would have to be less than your cost of tuition. Some questions of whether they could actually have the data to do that, but you can see that, and I know this is sincere, they are worried about a bad actor coming in, a big for-profit, and having a disaster, which we've seen before. And again, I think the politics have really shifted. If you remember when President Obama had the ratings plan, we're going to rate colleges. The original idea was to tie it to Pell eligibility. And I think a lot of people in higher ed were like, oh my gosh, Obama has betrayed us, the neoliberal, it's terrible. That's just an anomaly. It's not an anomaly. Democrats are going to continue to support these ROI policies, I think, and they're doing it in California. They're going to do it everywhere. And Tim Kaine proposed a short-term Pell program himself, so you could see a bipartisan bill, frankly, emerging under a Republican Congress to do that, and it'll be interesting to watch. I think the right question about short-term Pell, and this isn't me, this is actual experts, is the tracking one. You've got the quality problem, but the real question is, are we going to incentivize people, largely non-white people, as our system becomes less white in terms of higher education, to go into short-term programs where they can't work toward their degree They're not going to get a degree probably, and they may get stuck in dead-end jobs. And as you all know, the only real way to prevent that problem is to make sure that you can work toward a degree. And for this to be stackable, which doesn't really exist at scale, but I am optimistic that maybe it will. But to give you a sense of how challenging this is, so Amazon's free college program, I love talking about it because it's so big. They have incredible labor market data, and only certain programs can, if they have to have a high enough income that they're more than what Amazon is paying its entry-level workers in a distribution center, which is $18 to $19 an hour. So your program is not eligible if it leads to a lower pay than that. I heard, though, from a large hospital system that said, we would love to hire and to train distribution center workers through the free college program to be medical assistants, but in certain markets, medical assistants don't pay more, so they're not eligible. So, I mean, who's in the wrong here? I mean, I don't think anyone, frankly. I think Amazon's trying to do the right thing there. Some of these hospital companies probably actually can't pay more in certain markets, and so you're ineligible for one of the biggest job growths in that area. These are societal-wide problems. Just quickly, and I'll stop, I do think one of the areas to watch on this is these intermediaries that administer the education benefit programs of big employers. I'm talking about Guild, EdAssist, and InStride. They work with the employers, and at scale, particularly in healthcare, it looks like you're starting to see some employers paying to hire people with those kind of entry-level jobs, and then to pay for their education to become a nurse or to get to some of these degree holding higher paid fields. It's initial. I don't know what numbers we're looking at, but at least the desperation, frankly, in healthcare seems to be extreme enough that working again at scale with these intermediaries that can bring college partners to do tailored programs, they're actually creating stackable pathways to more sustainable jobs.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Once again, I think it's a great transition talking about the short-term credentials and industry credentials into the spotlight that we want to put on some of our work in Michigan. I think many of you who are on this call have heard about this work, but what I wanted to do is share with you an update on what we're doing in Michigan around the relationship between college programs and industry credentials. And so many of you are very familiar with all of the different ways that students can get credit for prior learning. And I think the most popular of those, at least in Michigan, have historically been through AP and CLEP. And when I came to Michigan many years ago, our colleges had there are about, I think, 9 colleges. Macomb Community College led the work around some short-term training programs through the TAC grants. And we were working on some transfer issues in Michigan, and some folks came to me and said, well, we need these courses. We committed to these courses would transfer between these 9 institutions. And we talked to the registrars, and that's going to be very difficult because of the credit to non-credit and some of those issues. And so those institutions use the industry credentials that students earned as a way to help transfer those credits between institutions. And we held on to that idea for many years, and we finally got hooked up with a funder who would be interested in helping us to help colleges document how they award credit for industry credentials. So as many of you know, community colleges, we prepare students for industry credentials. Students take a course at a community college. They'll typically go out and take an industry credential exam, or they'll do a demonstration of their skills, and then they'll be issued an industry credential. What we're trying to do in Michigan is take that process and do it the backwards way. And so a person that has an industry credential, they've had that evaluated, and then we'll award credit for those students who have that industry credential. This is work that's already happening at community colleges, but it is very poorly documented. It's also very, very poorly communicated to employers and to students that there's a relationship between our college credit course and our industry credential. We don't use the same language necessarily as what industry credentials use, and it's not very clear that, you know, a CIS 101 course is leading you to a CompTIA certification, for example. And so we want to do a better job of communicating that to students. If we go on to the next slide, many of you should recognize this as the homepage of the Michigan Transfer Network. And I'll show you a timeline later, but we'll be adding a new feature on here where students can search how they earn credit for industry credentials. So they'll select that option from the student drop-down menu, and they'll get to a page that looks like this, where they can search for a credential provider, and then they can search for a credential, or they can search for a receiving institution, or the institution that will award them credit for that. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see here some examples of what those providers would be. Many of these should be familiar to you because your courses line up to some of these industry credentials. So we've selected that there. And then imagining that we've finished our search process and we come up with our results. And we see here that if a student has earned CompTIA certification in Network Plus, A+, Linux Plus, or Security Plus, they would be able to receive credit for CNSS, various different courses at Bay College. So this is what we do as regular practice at community colleges and universities when students are transferring courses, but it's not regular practice of what we do when we're talking about industry credentials. So I think, you know, what Paul talked about in that connection there, it's so crucial for us as community colleges to communicate. And I hearken back to that both and issue that you were talking about, Paul, with Virginia Fox, is that sure, we can offer certificates and degrees, but we can also prepare students for industry credentials. And so MCCA is working to develop this tool so that colleges will be able to communicate that better. You'll also be able to see what your peers across the state are able to do or are awarding credit for as well. I want to scroll through a couple more slides just because with slides, I know it's hard to see sometimes, and we'll post our slides later. And this is all just, you know, kind of, this isn't live data necessarily, but you see that detailed view of the relationship between CompTIA certifications and the coursework at Bay College. If we go to the next slide, you'll see another example zoomed in a little bit more. Alpena Community College has a utility technician program. And if you already have a CDL, which many of their students do, when you come to Alpena, you'll get credit for UTT, 2 credit hours for UTT 206. If we continue, we're also able to see an example here in the culinary program at Grand Rapids Community College, that if a person is from the American Culinary Federation, a certified fundamentals pastry cook, they're able to get credit for 3 courses at Grand Rapids Community College. So we have the ability for those of you who are here who are more on the technical side of this, we can do one-to-one equivalencies, but we can also look at one credential to many courses. We can look at many credentials to one course or many credentials to many courses if we needed to do that. So these are all actually available now at these community colleges, but MCCA is really just creating the framework for colleges to be able to actually document this information and hopefully share it more widely in their communities. We've hosted a series of workshops over the last several months to address some of the other issues related to policy and ensuring that students actually know how they can get credit for these credentials. Again, I think it goes back to a communication issue that the system is just so confusing that we want to be able to communicate this information better. We do an excellent job at community colleges of asking students to submit their transcripts from previous institutions, and we want to apply that same thing to students who are submitting information about their credit for prior learning. This is a tentative timeline for when we're looking at launching this new feature on the transfer network. The most important thing I want to point out to you is that we have a workshop coming up on October 6th, and we'll put the link to that in the chat where I mean, this was a little 10-minute overview, but we'll be talking about this for a whole hour and have some opportunity to share more information about that as well. So with that, I want to pause and see if we've had any questions come through in the chat. I see that I got a private chat from Janice talking about OSHA training, another great example of something that many of our programs align to, and we can award credit for that for a student who has completed OSHA training as well. Any other questions? Great. So Paul, I get to turn it back over to you for, I hope you appreciate our alliteration here as a journalist, but we want to talk about transfer. And when Donna and I have been doing transfer work, and all the center has for many years in Michigan, and when we were on our prep call for this, I think you said that this transfer problem is just tricky. And so I want to hear your thoughts about the national transfer landscape, and then we'll turn it over to Donna and she'll talk about some of our work in Michigan.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, 10 years ago, I looked it up to make sure I was right about this. I had a series of pieces in Inside Higher Ed predicting that prior learning assessments time had come and was going to catch on. And I was wrong about that because it didn't. And I still worry about us having the same conversation 10 years from now. I don't think so, though. I think the pressure and the frustration, frankly, is so extreme with higher ed at this point. I talked to American Council on Education's board about some of these issues earlier this year, and they stopped me in like 3 minutes and said, yes, we agree, we know, we just need cover. I remember that phrase, to do more there, which I thought was really interesting. One example of the stick, I don't know if you call it the stick because they seem to do it without a lot of pushback, but Ohio I'm a native Ohioan, by the way, so there's some bias there, somehow has got these transfer guarantees in place. If you haven't seen the ITAG program, very interesting. They started with a practical nursing credential, guaranteed transfer across all publics in the state, all the way up to Ohio State. And they say they're going to do some 30 or so credentials through that system in the next couple of years. And I know that other states are looking at that, and some others are doing things like that. Just a couple, I'll just speed round here, a couple ideas that I've seen that are really interesting that get at this concept. I'm actually going to start with another Amazon provider. And the reason I'm using Amazon is I feel like they can drive change. These big companies, they have such scale. I mean, Amazon is essentially like the federal government. I feel like that when I call them, they're so big. They are working with an outlet that I just think is totally worth checking out. It's called Outlier. If you haven't heard of it, it's a startup online education provider. It's founded by the co-founder of Masterclass. You all know what that is, I think, the super high-end online course in terms of high-end in terms of production. Outlier is different in that it comes with credit. So the way they do it is at the course basis. They're affiliated with the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown. So those courses come with credit. They're accredited. And they just rolled out 2-year degrees with Golden Gate University. Again, small, it's a startup, but it's something you can sign up with if you're an Amazon employee. And if you look at the quality of the online product, it's very good. And you know, nothing is new in higher ed. This is essentially the Ivy Bridge play. Does anyone remember Ivy Bridge? Yes, okay. So, you know, for-profit online two-year degree provider partnered with Tiffin University, got Tiffin University's accreditation, this is probably 13 years ago now, to offer two-year degrees. Got up to scale very quickly. I think it was 20,000 students for a while, was shut down by the Higher Learning Commission with political pressure from the Obama administration. I recently talked to Paul Friedman, who is the founder of Ivy Bridge. He said if he could do something different now, he would have had it be debt-free, which I thought was very interesting. He just said these sort of programs aren't going to work if they carry debt loads. But, you know, they sued the Higher Learning Commission, and I believe they received a settlement. And, you know, it was never clear to me that that was a low quality provider. And I think it would be harder now to pursue someone like Outlier. It's a different time. So just quickly on professional certificates from big tech companies. Erica mentioned, you know, the kind of CompTIA certification. There's a bunch of new ones now. There's 19 through Coursera. And, you know, the thing is, just like anything in higher ed, these employer industry certifications, they're all different too. Like what Google is trying to do is totally different than what Meta is doing or Salesforce. And as I understand it, just briefly, you know, Google's entirely a philanthropic play. And like JP Morgan, it's that they feel that there's a societal collapse issue here. Their IT cert program is very well funded. They're not going to hire people who get their IT certs. They never said they would. This isn't for that. And frankly, they're not even teaching Google tools. They can't. It's funded through their foundation. This is, you know, an entry level familiarity with IT jobs. And I've heard it's quite good, actually. The program they spent a lot of money on. You know, Salesforce, Meta, and AWS, totally different. Those are about their platforms. AWS cloud certifications are extremely valuable in the market. 95% of cloud professionals hold one of them. But that's about, you know, AWS subsidizing learning on its tools, in part so that its tools continue to dominate the market. And you've got Meta, that's what they're doing with digital marketing, a lot of these ones. So they're all different. They're available through Coursera. They're ready, they're plug and play, and it's go time for all of these. They're marketing them heavily, and you're starting to see some institutions offering credit for them. One of the first four-year universities through the gates is the University of North Texas, which, by the way, is up to 45,000 students now. They are offering credit for incoming students who hold up to 5 of these certificates. One of the Google program management certificate, I believe they issue 9 credits for automatically. It's an ACE credit recommendation play there. And interestingly, to bring it full circle, when they're going to the Google, the Amazon fulfillment center near their campus, and they're helping students enroll in those certificate programs as part of their outreach to continuing education students, and it's working. So I suspect you're going to see more of those, but who knows? I also thought PLA was going to take off 10 years ago. Just one other concept that I think we're going to see more of, and this gets to alternate financing, and I can't, there's no way I can do this briefly, but I'm going to try. So income share agreements, you've all heard about them, politically out of favor, viewed as kind of indentured servitude and usurious, and everybody knows Mitch Daniels at Purdue tried it and failed, and we don't like Mitch, so it's bad. And you know, you see these media accounts of somebody who went to a boot camp. Sometimes they're making 6 figures, but they're not happy about having to repay their ISA. Well, income share agreements through Purdue are not the only way you're going to see this happen. Not even close. Outcomes-based loans. I think you're going to be hearing a lot more of that. Basically, they're admitting their loans, unlike income share agreements. So that clears up some of the regulatory problems. That's what Google is doing with its $100 million fund through a company, a nonprofit called Social Finance, which also is doing this now with states. So New Jersey has what it's calling its Pay It Forward Fund, where you get a no interest loan to attend a short-term program. And it's subsidized by the state. So I think to get to, I mean, I think what's happening there is some of these big companies and some of the governments realize a short-term credential alone isn't going to work unless there's some wraparound supports for students, all stuff you all know from long ago. But the companies are getting more sophisticated about this, and they're finding out how to finance the wraparound supports through these tools. Last thing I'll mention, when you do a transfer or degree completion program that's sponsored by an employer with a work commitment, I've seen a couple of these start. Grand Valley State's the first one I've seen through the gates actually doing it, where you have basically a healthcare company saying, we will pay for you to finish your nursing degree if you come work for us for 2 years. It looked like Deloitte was going to do this with Arizona State and Northeastern for their employees, where if you finish at a community college, they will pay for you to finish an online bachelor's degree if you work for them for 2 years. Again, kind of this no interest loan, pay it forward concept. I think if you attach that to professional certificates and transfer credit promises, you could see how things could change substantially. A lot of information tried to boil down very briefly. I hope it made sense.
Thank you, Paul. No, you did a great job. Paul touched on several examples of what's been successful in other states. And in many cases, those examples are in places where higher ed is governed through a board at the state level or somehow through the legislature. And that's not the case in Michigan. As a decentralized state, we have always been presented with several obstacles to accomplish meaningful transfer work. However, the information I'm about to share is really blazing a new trail, in my opinion, in terms of supporting transfer students and kind of taking away some of the confusion about what options they may have. Erica talked about the various strategies that are in lighter blue here, and I'm really going to focus on the transfer pathways to bachelor's degrees. The work on the Michigan workforce transfer pathways was actually started by my colleague, Katie Giardello. I don't think Katie's on the call today. She's been participating a little bit throughout the week, but I didn't see her on the list today, but she's now at CUNY. She sent out, and then I followed up with that in terms of a survey was sent to public and private four-year institutions in the state seeking information on which bachelor's degrees that they offer would be appropriate for pathways in general applied science, applied business, healthcare, and information technology. We focused on these in terms of looking at the associate's degree in the applied science area. So then I followed up with a survey to the community colleges asking for the same type of information. We collected all this data. Issues were discussed based on things that were presented, revisions were made. As an example, some community colleges offered a program such as dental hygiene that was in some cases 100+ credits. The challenge with that is the fact that four-year institutions have residency requirements. So if the expectation was the student would transfer in more than 100 credits at the community college level, it would make it very difficult for that student to meet the residency requirement without having to take excess credits, as an example. So we actually capped the associate's degrees that are going to be part of this program to 90 credits or less. There was also a discussion between the differentiation between the applied business pathway as part of this program, and then how did that differ from the business transfer agreements that we included in the MI transfer business pathways. So we stepped back, took a real detailed look at a lot of that, and made a determination that only those associate's degrees that were considered more of a terminal degree and weren't set up as a transfer program would be included as part of the MI workforce transfer pathways. Draft language was developed for the terms of the agreement. We sent that out for review. The agreements have been assembled at this point, and I'm happy to say that as of Wednesday of this week, all signatures from the participating institutions have been received, and we'll be posting all of this information next week on mitransfer.org. So I know this is a very colorful slide, so hopefully it'll wake you up on a Friday afternoon. On the left-hand side of the page are all of the participating community colleges at this point. And that includes 25 of now the 31 community colleges, if you consider the new tribal colleges that are now part of the association. On the right-hand side of the page are 10 public and private independent institutions that are participating in the issue agreements. These agreements will continue to evolve and develop as part of the regular kind of the fall and then the spring join modify cycle that we have set up for the MI transfer pathways. So we're hoping to add participants to this list in the coming months as part of the fall cycle. More impressive than the last slide, in my opinion, are the actual numbers of degrees that we've included as part of this work. The chart shows the number of institutions and degrees by the 4 program areas: the general applied science, the healthcare, applied business, and information technology. Collectively, the participating community colleges have a total of 529 associate degree programs that they are including as part of this work. And the 4-year institutions are offering a total of 44 bachelor's degrees. Some degrees are offered in more than one of those pathways. Thus, it's a unique total of 21 bachelor's degrees. Examples of the types of associate's degrees and programs included are things like manufacturing engineering technology, hospitality management, cardiac sonography, and as Paul mentioned, this huge demand in cybersecurity that is included as part of these options. From the bachelor's degree side, there's options such as Bachelor of Applied Science in Applied Management, Bachelor of Science in Integrative Professional Studies, Bachelor of Science in Allied Health Science, and Bachelor of Science in Computer Information Technology. The MI workforce agreements go beyond the Michigan Transfer Pathway agreements in a few key ways. Participating 4-year institutions agree to accept the full associate's degree listed in the agreements. And that's the part, in my opinion, that's transformative based on all of the work that we've tried to accomplish, in many cases, statewide. This means there will not be a course-by-course evaluation for transferability. However, there are caveats that the students need to meet, such as a minimum grade of 2.0 or better in each course. Institutions, 4-year institutions, also agree to accept additional MTA credits, the Michigan Transfer Agreement credits, if they are not already a part of the Associate of Applied Science degree. This means a community college student could transfer up to 90 credits towards that bachelor's degree. Lastly, one of the terms references credit for prior learning. The 4-year colleges and universities participating in these agreements agree to accept CPL or PLA, whichever term you want to use, that was previously applied to the associate's degree. This key term did prevent some bachelor's degree granting institutions from participating, but it is a major benefit for community college students who already have that life experience in their field and then can apply it towards their degree. I would like to suggest to the community colleges on the call that these terms, in terms of accepting the full associate's degree, as well as the credit for prior learning component, be used as a starting point when negotiating your own individual transfer agreements. The more we can convey to the 4-year institutions that these are important components for our students and for degree completion at the state level, the more they'll get the message that perhaps they need to evaluate their policies and start to develop one related to credit for prior learning. And then if they do have one, make sure that they work with the community colleges to ensure that students' time is not wasted. So these groundbreaking agreements are impressive in so many ways for the state of Michigan. They support initiatives to increase the number of bachelor's degrees while expanding access to these opportunities across the state. They simplify the options for the students by removing provisos and exceptions related to complicated transfer and articulation agreements. The student who completes an associate's degree, an applied associate's degree, included in the agreement, is assured that the credits earned will be applied to one of the bachelor's degrees listed. Our hope and goal is to use these agreements as a foundation for documenting and developing future opportunities and other programs for bachelor's degree completion. Next, I want to talk about our timeline for next steps. As I mentioned, probably next week, we're going to be able to post those agreements to the mitransfer.org website for you to be able to view in more detail. Again, as I mentioned, they'll be part of the Join Modify cycle that follows the protocol for the MI transfer pathways. And that protocol can be found on the mitransfer.org website. At this point now and moving forward, we're just not going to throw caution to the wind and hope that you guys all figure this out, make sure that, you know, your advisors and counselors know all this information to be able to communicate to students. We're going to make sure that we provide training. We're going to provide some office hours that we can, that you can kind of join in on. And then we're also going to help with marketing launch in terms of not only posting information and getting that communicated on the our transfer website, but also your own websites and adding those links from the mitransfer.org site back to your website so students can get more information. So we've covered some of the national and state level issues related to transfer. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Check the chat. It's not just me, Deirdre. It was definitely a team effort to try to get this done, but thank you. Okay. So moving on. Our contact information is provided. So if you have any additional questions or need clarification on anything, our contact information will be included in the slides to contact us. As Erica mentioned early on, here's a list of some of the references that we've talked about as part of this presentation. I know that there's been a lot of links provided in the chat as well. And then here's the session evaluation slide. I'm hoping that maybe Precious or Erica will put the link in the chat for that. And I'm sure you're familiar with the QR code that you can hold your camera up, take a picture of that QR code, and it'll link you to the evaluation form as well. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Erica to talk about the networking portion of our day.
Great, thanks, Donna. Before we transition over to that, I wanted to thank Paul so much for joining us today. I'm the job devotee. I love seeing it in my inbox every week. It has really helped me I really trust what Paul writes about and understand a lot about the sort of changing ecosystem in higher education across the country. So Paul, appreciate all of the work you do with that and your support for us at the Center for Student Success. And also to thank Donna. So Deirdre, I don't think you're wrong. I think a huge part of these transfer agreements was thanks to Donna's accomplishments. So I really appreciate her leadership and all of the work that she does to make this happen. I think it's such a wonderful opportunity for our students to find more and better opportunities for them to complete bachelor's degrees in Michigan. So for those of you who have been with us for the last 4 days, you know we have reserved about the last 15 minutes for what we call speed networking. So if you want to stick around for the next 15 minutes and you're interested in meeting some people from across the state, we kind of think of this as, I call it the coffee break. I think Jenny called it the cookie break. Maybe it's Friday at 4:15. Maybe we'll call it happy hour. But that opportunity that you had when you were back in person to talk with your peers across the state, we want to try to give you that opportunity. You know, the MCCA, we have to plan this event a year in advance, and it's really kind of hard to believe where we were a year ago when we were trying to plan this. It seemed impossible that we would be able to have an in-person convening in the fall of 2022. So that's why we're here virtually. With that said, I'm going to open up the breakout rooms for about the next 15 minutes. You should be in those breakout rooms with, you know, a few of your peers from across the state, just to try to meet a couple folks and, you know, see what you can talk about from our session today. I'm gonna open those up right now, and you should be able to get connected in those rooms. And we will see you next year at the Student Success Summit. Thank you all so much.